Now coming back to our main.py, our previous program had a label, a button, and an entry, and it was relatively simple. So I'm going to head back to this main.py file where we've got only 3 widgets so that I can show you how we can define the layout and positioning of each of our widgets. Firstly, I've reconfigured the file a little bit, so I've moved the button clicked function to the top, and I've made sure that each of the pack methods are at the very end of each widget. That way we'll be able to work with it quite easily. Now, as I mentioned before, Tkinter has a whole bunch of different layout managers that define how to position each of the widgets in your GUI program. Now, there's 3 that you should know about: pack, place, and grid. Now, firstly, we've already seen pack, and all that pack does is it basically packs each of the widgets next to each other in a vaguely logical format. And by default, pack will always start from the top and then pack every other widget just below the previous one. As I mentioned, you can change this by adding a side parameter, and you can change it to, for example, side left. And if you change this for all of the packs, then it's going to pack everything starting from the left edge of the program, like this. And you can change that to bottom or right as well. But the problem with pack is that it's actually quite difficult to specify a precise position. So for example, if you wanted this label to be a little bit up and then this button a little bit down and this entry all the way to the right, it's very, very complicated to do that using pack. And that's why there's not just a single layout manager, but there's lots of others. So let's take a look at the next one, which is called place. Place is all about precise positioning. So when you place something, you can provide a X and Y value. So for example, I can say my label.place, and then I can say, well, the X value should equal 0 and the Y value should equal 0. And this just places that label at the top left corner. Now, it's important to remember that if a widget gets created, but it doesn't have any layout specified using pack, place, or grid, then it won't be shown. As you can see here, we've only got the label showing up. Now that we've placed our label to the top left corner, we can try placing it somewhere else. So let's move it a little bit along the x-axis. So let's say place it at 100, 0. That moves it to the right a bit more. And if we want to move it down, we can change the Y position. So now it's down at the bottom and then the X is 100. Now remember, we've defined the width and height. So the width is 500 pixels, the height is 300 pixels, and anywhere along that screen, you can define a X and Y value for a particular widget to place it at that precise position. The downside of place, on the other hand, is the fact that it is so specific, and we have to work out in our head the coordinate and where to put each widget. It's simple enough if you've only got 3 widgets like we have here, but if you have 100 or 50, then that becomes quickly a bit of a nightmare to manage the precise coordinates of each widget. So in addition to pack and place, there's also a final layout manager, which also happens to be my favorite one, which is the grid. And the grid is a really simple concept. It imagines that your entire program is a grid, and you can divide it into any number of columns and rows that you want to. So just as a reminder, the rows are the ones that go along the horizontal, and the columns are the ones that go along the vertical. If I remove my place and instead I use my grid, I could say my label.grid, and then I can provide a column and a row number. So let's say I'm going to put it at the first column and the first row. So then it starts from 0. So we could say column equals 0, row equals 0, and you can see that it gets placed in the top left corner. Now, the grid system is relative to other components. So even if I change this column to, 5 and the row to 5, you can see that it doesn't actually change the layout because there is no widget in column 4, 3, 2, or 1. So it's still the first one in the grid. So the easiest way of working with the grid is starting with the thing that you want to be at the top left, defining a starting column and row 0, 0, and then for the next and subsequent widgets to just keep going through it and define its position on the grid. For example, if I wanted the button to be on column 1 and row 1, and then I want my entry, which is called input, to be on the grid in column 2 and row 2. Now, if you run this, you can see it's now been laid out along our grid. And this is effectively what it looks like. Our label is in column 0, row 0, button in column 1, row 1, and entry in column 2, row 2. This is one of the easiest ways of visualizing and creating the layout for your Tkinter programs. And it's really flexible and it's really easy to imagine and understand. So this is always my preferred way of working with the layouts for Tkinter. Just a word of warning though, you can't mix up grid and pack in the same program. So for example, if I wanted my label and my button to be defined by the grid, but then I decide to use the pack method for my final entry, then you can see I actually get an error when I run my code. It says cannot use Geometry Manager pack, which already has slaves managed by grid. So these two are incompatible with each other. You basically have to choose one or the other. And often I will choose grid because it's just more flexible and more easy to understand. So now here comes a challenge for you. I want you to change the code that we've already written so that we end up with this layout. So we've already got a label, a button, and an entry. I want you to add a new button, and it should be positioned like this. Have a think about how you might solve this challenge using the grid system that you learned about just now. Pause the video and complete the challenge. All right, so the first thing you notice is that the label is still at column 0, row 0, button is still at row 1, column 1, but this new button is now at row 0, column 2. So let's go ahead and create it. Now I'm just going to create a new button and I'm not going to worry about its command or any of that. I'll give it a piece of text just so that we can identify it, and I'll call it new button. But then the most important thing is how we lay out this new button. So I'm going to use the grid system and I'm going to give it a column of 2 because it is 0, 1, 2, the third column from the left, and then row is going to be 0. Now, when I run this code though, you'll notice something a little bit odd. Why is the entry below the button? Because in our example, the entry is actually over on the right of this new button in a new column. By putting this new button in between the old button and the entry, we've actually changed the positioning of that entry on the grid. So we've actually had to move it along into the next column. So to do that, we have to change the grid of our entry. Instead of having column 2, to make it column 3, just so that it's on the right of this new button. And now when I run it, this has the exact layout that we wanted, and we've now learned a little bit about how we can precisely position our widgets in our program using the pack, place, and grid layout managers. The very last thing I want to show you with relation to layout and design of our GUI programs is how to add a little bit of padding around components. The easiest way to add padding is actually to directly modify the widgets. So for example, if I wanted a bit of padding around all of the elements in my window, so basically add it around the edge of the window, then I could simply say window.config, and I can change the padding in the x-axis and the padding in the y-axis, so pad x and pad y. So now if I run this program as it is, you can see that there's now more space being added around all four edges of our program. Now I can make this a lot more extreme. So let's say I add the pad X to be 100 and the pad Y to be 200. You can see just how much padding we've now added. And this just means that you add more space around your program and it makes things easier to see and looks a little bit nicer. If you want to add padding around a specific widget, not just the entire window, then you can do the same with that widget. So we could get hold of my label and again using config to change the pad X and the pad Y. So let's add maybe, 50 pixels of padding in the X and in the Y. Now you can see that around that label, there's a whole lot of space so that it pushes everything else away and actually makes the entire program window a lot bigger. So this is just a way for you to be able to add a space around your widgets so that they're not all crushed together, and it helps you with your layout and your design.